The strangest thing about living with someone is that you start noticing the things they think nobody else can see. I heard Noah say those words at 2:17 in the morning, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. My bedroom door was slightly open, and a thin line of light stretched across the hardwood floor of our apartment. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, and the city of Seattle slept beneath a blanket of clouds. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, trying to understand why my roommate was awake in the middle of the night. We had been sharing the apartment for almost a year, long enough for me to know his routines. Noah Bennett was the kind of person who went to sleep before 11, woke up before sunrise, and somehow managed to keep his side of the kitchen spotless at all times. Spontaneous conversations at 2 in the morning were not part of his personality. Curious, I stepped into the hallway and found him sitting alone on the small balcony outside our living room. He wore gray sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the rain-soaked skyline. He did not turn around when I opened the sliding door. "You know it is freezing out here, right?" I asked. Noah smiled without looking at me. "I could say the same thing about your habit of wandering around at night." I pulled my hoodie tighter and sat in the empty chair beside him. The wind carried the smell of rain and distant traffic. For a while, neither of us said anything. That had always been easy with Noah. Silence never felt uncomfortable around him. It simply existed, like the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen or the coffee machine starting every morning at 7. "Could not sleep?" I finally asked. He shrugged. "Something like that." I studied his profile in the dim light coming from the apartment. We were complete opposites in almost every way. I worked as a graphic designer for a small advertising agency downtown, surviving on deadlines and caffeine, while Noah spent his days writing software code from an office overlooking Elliott Bay. He was calm where I was impulsive, organized where I was chaotic. When we first met, through an online apartment listing, I assumed we would tolerate each other for a few months before going our separate ways. Instead, somewhere between shared grocery runs and late-night takeout, Noah had become the person I spent the most time with. The strange part was that I still could not figure him out. Over the past year, little moments had accumulated in the back of my mind. There was the afternoon he reached across me to grab a coffee mug and left his hand resting against mine for a second too long before apologizing with an awkward smile. There was the movie night when he fell asleep on the couch beside me, his shoulder pressed against mine until sunrise, only to insist the next morning that he must have rolled over by accident. Then there were the smaller things. The way he remembered exactly how I liked my coffee, the fact that my favorite snack somehow appeared in our kitchen after particularly stressful weeks, or how he always seemed to know when something was wrong before I said a single word. Every time I caught myself wondering whether those moments meant anything, I shut the thought down immediately. It was easier that way. Easier to believe that Noah was simply kind. Easier to pretend that my heart did not beat a little faster whenever he smiled at me from across the room. "You are staring," Noah said quietly, pulling me back to the present. I looked away, embarrassed. "Sorry, just tired." He laughed softly and leaned back in his chair. "You know, Ethan, I think people spend too much time convincing themselves that certain things are accidents." I frowned. What is that supposed to mean? For the first time since I had joined him on the balcony, Noah turned and looked directly at me. The city lights reflected in his eyes, making it impossible to read his expression. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something important, then changed his mind. "Nothing," he said after a moment. "Forget it." But I could not forget it. Not when he stood up and disappeared into his bedroom a few minutes later, leaving me alone with the rain and a question I could not stop asking myself. Because as I sat there listening to the storm roll across Seattle, I found myself replaying every strange moment we had shared over the past year. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether Noah had ever really believed those accidents were accidents at all. The next morning, I convinced myself that Noah's strange comment on the balcony meant nothing. That was what I always did whenever something about him unsettled me. I turned confusing moments into harmless misunderstandings because the alternative required asking questions that I was not prepared to answer. By 8 o'clock, Seattle was wrapped in its usual blanket of gray clouds, and our apartment smelled like coffee and toasted bread. I walked into the kitchen expecting awkward silence after the conversation we had not really finished, but Noah stood at the counter as if nothing unusual had happened. He was wearing dark jeans and a navy sweater, one hand wrapped around his coffee mug while the other scrolled through emails on his phone. "Morning," he said casually. "You look terrible." I opened the refrigerator and rolled my eyes. "Thanks. You always know exactly what to say." He smiled. "You were the one wandering around in the middle of the night." I wanted to bring up what he had said on the balcony, to ask him why he suddenly seemed determined to speak in riddles. But instead I poured myself coffee and changed the subject. That was becoming a pattern with us. We talked constantly about work, movies, grocery lists, and weekend plans, yet somehow we avoided the conversations that actually mattered. Later that afternoon, while I sat at my desk downtown trying to finish a logo design before a deadline, my phone buzzed with a message from Noah. I expected him to ask whether we needed milk or paper towels, but instead I found a picture of the sandwich shop near my office. Underneath the photo, he had written, "They brought back your favorite turkey sandwich." I stared at the screen, confused. I had mentioned liking that sandwich exactly once, months earlier, during a random conversation while we cleaned the apartment. Somehow, Noah had remembered. "You seriously keep track of my lunch preferences?" I texted back. His reply came almost immediately. "Someone has to. Make sure you eat something besides coffee." I laughed quietly and set my phone down, but the message stayed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. The truth was that Noah noticed things about me that other people ignored. He knew which songs I skipped whenever they played in the car. He knew that I always became anxious before meeting new clients. He knew that I called my younger sister every Sunday evening, even though I pretended to find those conversations exhausting. Most people move through life without paying attention to details like that. Noah collected them. That evening, I arrived home just after 6 carrying takeout containers from our favorite Thai restaurant. Noah was already there, sitting cross-legged on the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. "Please tell me you got extra spring rolls." I held up the bag. "You ask that every time." "Because every time there is a chance you forgot." We ate dinner in front of the television, arguing over what movie to watch. Eventually, Noah chose an old comedy neither of us had seen in years. Halfway through the movie, my phone rang. The screen lit up with my sister's name. Noah muted the television without me asking and stood to give me privacy, but I waved him back down. "It is just Olivia," I said. My sister spent most of the conversation talking about her upcoming move to Chicago and complaining about apartment prices. Near the end of the call, her voice softened. "How is the roommate situation going?" she asked. I glanced toward Noah, who was pretending not to listen while focusing very hard on the movie. "It is good," I said carefully. "Actually, better than good." Olivia laughed. "You talk about him a lot, you know." "That is because we live together." "Sure," she replied, clearly unconvinced. After we hung up, I tossed my phone onto the coffee table and tried to ignore the warmth rising into my face. Noah glanced at me from the other end of the couch. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah." I hesitated. My sister just likes asking too many questions. Noah nodded slowly and returned his attention to the movie, but a few minutes later, something happened. That pulled me out of the story on the screen completely. Reaching for the bowl of popcorn between us, our hands brushed together. Normally, one of us would have moved away immediately. Instead, Noah froze for half a second, his eyes meeting mine in the glow of the television. Then, just as quickly, he pulled back and cleared his throat. "Sorry," he said. I looked down at the popcorn, suddenly unable to focus on anything else. Because deep down, I was beginning to suspect that the strangest thing about all of this was not how often these moments happened. It was how determined Noah seemed to be to call every single one of them an accident. 3 days passed after the movie night, and life inside our apartment settled back into its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Noah left for work before I woke up most mornings, and I spent my days buried beneath design revisions and impossible deadlines. Yet something had changed, something small but impossible to ignore. Every interaction between us suddenly felt loaded with meaning. Every smile lasted a little too long. Every accidental touch lingered in my memory long after it happened. The worst part was that I could not tell whether the change was real or whether I was imagining it. On Thursday evening, my phone buzzed while I was finishing a presentation at the office. The message came from Noah. "Do not make dinner plans. My friend invited us to a game night." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Us." A few seconds later, 3 dots appeared. "You have lived with me for almost a year. It would be weird if I stopped inviting you places now." I smiled despite myself and agreed to go. By 7 o'clock, we were driving through Capitol Hill beneath a sky heavy with rain clouds. Noah tapped the steering wheel in time with the music while I watched the city lights blur past the window. You know, I said, I still find it strange that you have friends. He glanced at me with mock offense. That is incredibly rude. You barely talk to anyone. I talk to you. The answer came so quickly that neither of us seemed prepared for it. I looked out the window before he could see my reaction. The game night took place in a cozy apartment filled with people from Noah's office. There were snacks spread across the kitchen island, music playing quietly in the background, and the constant noise of overlapping conversations. Noah slipped into the group effortlessly, laughing more than I was used to seeing. Watching him there felt oddly disorienting. At home, he was reserved and thoughtful. Here, surrounded by old friends, another side of him emerged. I stood near the bookshelf with a drink in my hand, feeling slightly out of place, when a woman with curly blonde hair walked over and smiled. You must be Ethan. That obvious? She laughed. Noah talks about you all the time. I nearly dropped my cup. He does. Constantly. She introduced herself as Claire and leaned against the wall beside me. I feel like I already know everything about you. I tried to laugh, but something in my expression must have betrayed my surprise because Claire's smile softened. Do not worry. Mostly harmless things. Your terrible sleep schedule. Your obsession with old movies. The fact that you forget to buy groceries unless Noah reminds you. I stared across the room at Noah, who was helping someone shuffle cards at the dining table. He looked up unexpectedly and caught me watching him. For a brief second, his expression shifted into something unreadable before he smiled and waved me over. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of card games and conversations, but Claire's comment stayed in my mind. Noah talked about me all the time. The realization followed me home later that night as we climbed the stairs to our apartment. Your friends are nice, I said casually while unlocking the front door. Noah shrugged off his jacket. They liked you. I hesitated. Claire said something interesting. He froze for the smallest fraction of a second. That sounds dangerous. She said you talk about me a lot. Noah disappeared into the kitchen, suddenly very interested in putting leftovers into the refrigerator. I live with you. It would be strange if I never mentioned you. That is not what she meant. He closed the refrigerator door and leaned against the counter. And what do you think she meant? The question hung between us. I wanted to answer honestly, but honesty had always terrified me. Instead, I shrugged. I do not know. Noah studied me for a moment before looking away. People see what they want to see, Ethan. Normally, I would have let the conversation end there, but something inside me refused to let go. And what do you see? I asked quietly. Noah looked genuinely surprised by the question. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then his phone buzzed on the counter, breaking whatever invisible tension had settled over the room. He glanced at the screen and sighed. Just work, he muttered. The moment vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Later that night, after Noah had gone to bed, I called my younger sister. Olivia answered on the second ring. You only call this late when something is wrong, she said immediately. I laughed. Maybe I just miss you. Absolutely not. Tell me what happened. I hesitated before describing the evening, leaving out the details that felt too dangerous to say out loud. Olivia listened patiently, and when I finished, she was quiet for several seconds. Ethan, she finally said, have you ever considered that maybe you are not confused because he is sending mixed signals? I frowned. What is that supposed to mean? She sighed. Maybe you are confused because you are scared that the signals are actually real. I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to explain why she was wrong. But as I sat alone in the dark living room, staring toward Noah's closed bedroom door, I realized that for the first time in months, I was not entirely sure that she was. Saturday arrived with the kind of cold rain that made Seattle feel smaller. The streets below our apartment disappeared beneath gray clouds, and the sound of water hitting the windows became the background noise of the entire day. I had planned to spend the afternoon catching up on work, but sometime after lunch, the lights flickered twice before the apartment suddenly fell silent. My computer screen went black, the kitchen appliances shut down, and Noah looked up from the couch with an expression that was equal parts annoyed and amused. Perfect timing, he said. I glanced outside at the storm. Do power outages happen often here? Noah stood and walked toward the hallway closet. Not usually, which means this one will probably last all day. He returned carrying flashlights and a box of candles as if he had been preparing for this exact situation for years. Watching him move confidently around the dark apartment made me laugh. You really are secretly 80 years old. He handed me a flashlight. And yet you continue choosing to live with me. The electricity did not come back by evening. By 6 o'clock, our apartment was lit only by candles scattered across the kitchen counter and living room shelves. Without television, computers, or the constant distractions that usually filled our weekends, the silence between us became impossible to ignore. Noah suggested ordering takeout before the restaurants closed, and an hour later, we sat on the floor eating noodles by candlelight like characters in some independent movie that neither of us would admit we enjoyed. This is weirdly nice, I admitted. Noah smiled. You say that now. Give it another hour. I leaned back against the couch and studied him across the room. The soft light changed everything about his face, smoothing away the usual distance he carried around other people. It struck me how rarely we actually looked at each other without something else demanding our attention. Can I ask you something? I said. Noah glanced up from his food. That depends on the question. Claire said you talk about me all the time. He laughed quietly. We are still discussing that. You avoided answering. Noah set down his takeout container and crossed his arms. You are surprisingly stubborn when you want to be. That is not an answer. For a moment, he said nothing. Rain hammered against the windows, and somewhere outside, a car alarm briefly echoed through the neighborhood. Finally, Noah sighed. You want the truth? I nodded. He looked down at the floor before speaking. I talk about you because you became important to me a long time ago. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Noah noticed my expression and immediately looked away. Forget I said that. No, I said too quickly. Do not do that. He frowned. Do what? Say something honest, and then pretend it never happened. Noah leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. You make it sound like I do that often. I laughed nervously. You do. The corner of his mouth lifted into a smile, but it disappeared almost immediately. Maybe some things are easier to call accidents. His words landed with more weight than he probably intended. For months, maybe even longer, I had convinced myself that every strange moment between us meant nothing. The late-night conversations, the lingering glances, the way Noah somehow remembered details about my life that I barely remembered telling him. Every time something felt too personal, too meaningful, one of us stepped back and blamed timing or coincidence. Why? I asked quietly. Noah turned toward me. Why what? Why pretend? He held my gaze for several seconds before answering. Because pretending is safer. I wanted to argue with him, but the truth was that I understood exactly what he meant. My entire life had been built around safer choices, safer conversations, safer versions of myself. Outside, the storm continued to move across the city, rattling the windows and darkening the sky. Inside our apartment, candlelight flickered between us as the silence stretched longer and longer. Eventually, Noah stood and carried our empty containers into the kitchen. I should clean up, he said. I watched him disappear around the corner, feeling the strange certainty that something had shifted again between us. An hour later, while searching for extra blankets in the hallway closet, I accidentally knocked over a stack of boxes. One of them fell open at my feet, spilling old photographs and books across the floor. Careful, Noah called from the kitchen. I bent down to pick everything up, but then I froze. Resting between the pages of a notebook was a photograph from my birthday party 6 months earlier, a picture I did not remember giving him. On the back, written in Noah's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words that made my heart stop for a moment. Do not ruin this. My fingers tightened around the photograph as if letting go of it would somehow erase what I had just seen. The candlelight flickered across the ink on the back, making the words seem almost unreal. Do not ruin this. 4 simple words, written casually enough that they could have meant anything. Yet somehow they felt heavier than every conversation Noah and I had shared during the past few months. Everything okay in there? He called from the kitchen. I quickly slid the picture back into the notebook and stacked the fallen boxes before answering. Yeah, I knocked some things over. For a moment, I considered asking him about the photograph immediately. I could walk into the kitchen, hold it up, and demand an explanation. But the thought terrified me, because if I asked, he would answer. And if he answered honestly, my entire understanding of us might change forever. So instead, I placed everything back into the closet and shut the door. The power returned shortly after midnight with the sudden hum of appliances coming back to life. Noah looked up from the couch and smiled. Civilization survives another day. I forced a laugh, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Before going to bed, I paused outside his room. The door was half open, and he sat at his desk scrolling through something on his phone. "Good night," I said. Noah glanced up. "Good night, Ethan." For the first time since we had moved in together, I almost stepped into his room to say something more. Instead, I walked away. Sleep did not come easily. I kept replaying every moment from the past year, searching for clues that I had missed. The way Noah always waited for me to get home before eating dinner. The fact that he remembered the smallest details about my family. The strange expression on his face whenever someone asked whether either of us was dating someone. Suddenly, memories that once seemed meaningless fit together differently. By morning, exhaustion sat behind my eyes like a headache. Noah had already left for work when I entered the kitchen, but he had left coffee on the counter along with a note written on a napkin. "You look tired. Drink this." I stared at the handwriting for several seconds before shaking my head. "This cannot be happening," I muttered to myself. Unfortunately, it was happening, and things only became more complicated later that afternoon. Around 4 o'clock, I received a message from Claire. "I am grabbing coffee near your office. Join me." Under normal circumstances, I would have declined. But curiosity had been building inside me since game night, and part of me suspected that Claire knew more than she had admitted. 20 minutes later, I found her sitting near the window of a crowded cafe, waving me over with an amused expression. "You look terrible," she said as I sat down. "Thank you for the support." She smiled and slid a cup of coffee toward me. "Let me guess. You are overthinking something." I hesitated, trying to decide how honest to be. Eventually, I settled on the truth. "How long have you known Noah?" "Almost 5 years." "Has he always been so difficult?" Claire laughed loudly enough to attract a few stares from nearby tables. "Noah is not difficult. Noah is terrified." Her answer caught me off guard. "Terrified of what?" She stirred her coffee, suddenly looking thoughtful. "Losing people, mostly." "That sounds dramatic." "You do not know his family." I leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean?" Claire hesitated before speaking. "Look, it is not my story to tell. But Noah has spent most of his life pretending to be someone simpler than he really is. It is easier for him that way." The words sent an uncomfortable chill through me because they sounded painfully familiar. I looked down at my coffee. And what if someone gets tired of pretending? Claire studied me carefully, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally, she smiled. "Then maybe they stop waiting for accidents to explain everything." We sat in silence for a few moments after that. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalk beneath gray skies, wrapped in scarves and heavy jackets. Ordinary lives continued around us while my own seemed to tilt in an entirely new direction. Before leaving, Claire stood and grabbed her coat. "For what it is worth," she said, "I have never seen Noah care about anyone the way he cares about you." I watched her disappear into the crowd, my thoughts spinning faster than ever. That evening, I returned home expecting another quiet night, but the moment I opened the apartment door, I knew something was wrong. Noah sat alone on the couch, staring at his phone with an expression I had never seen before. He looked up as I entered, and for the first time since I had met him, he seemed completely uncertain. "Ethan," he said quietly, "my brother is coming to Seattle tomorrow." The moment Noah mentioned his brother, the atmosphere inside the apartment shifted. He set his phone down on the coffee table and ran a hand through his hair, clearly more nervous than he wanted to admit. I dropped my backpack by the door and sat in the armchair across from him. "That sounds serious," I said. Noah let out a quiet laugh, without any humor behind it. "It usually is." Over the past year, I had heard stories about his family, but they were always vague, missing details that seemed intentionally left out. I knew his parents still lived in Oregon. I knew his older brother, Daniel, worked in finance and visited rarely. Beyond that, Noah rarely volunteered information. "Are you close?" I asked. Noah looked toward the darkening window. "We used to be." The answer was simple, but something about his expression suggested that the real story was much more complicated. I wanted to ask more questions, yet something told me to wait. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and started making dinner while Noah remained on the couch. A few minutes later, he joined me, leaning against the counter in unusual silence. "You do not have to stay tomorrow if you have plans," he said suddenly. I turned to look at him. "Are you trying to get rid of me?" No, his answer came too quickly. "I just thought it might be awkward." I smiled slightly. "For who?" Noah opened the refrigerator and pretended to search for something. "For everyone." The next morning, I woke to the sound of cabinets opening and closing. Noah was already dressed, pacing through the apartment while cleaning things that did not need cleaning. He adjusted books on the shelves, reorganized the kitchen, and checked his phone every few minutes. Watching him unravel over a family visit felt strangely surreal. "You know your brother is not inspecting the apartment, right?" I asked from the doorway. Noah glanced at me and forced a smile. "You have never met Daniel." Around noon, the buzzer rang. Noah froze for half a second before walking to the door. I stayed in the kitchen, unsure whether I should disappear or introduce myself. A few moments later, a tall man stepped inside carrying an overnight bag. Daniel looked enough like Noah to make the relationship obvious, but where Noah was quiet and thoughtful, his brother radiated confidence. "You must be Ethan," Daniel said, shaking my hand firmly. "I have heard a lot about you." The sentence caught me off guard because I was beginning to hear it far too often. Noah immediately turned toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" he asked, almost too loudly. Daniel smiled as his brother retreated. "Still avoiding conversations, I see." Throughout the afternoon, the three of us wandered through Pike Place Market and along the waterfront. Daniel was friendly and easy to talk to, telling stories from their childhood that Noah unsuccessfully tried to interrupt whenever they became embarrassing. For a while, everything seemed normal. Yet beneath the surface, I noticed subtle changes in Noah. He laughed less. He checked his phone constantly. He seemed tense in ways I had never seen before. That evening, after dinner, Noah volunteered to pick up dessert from a bakery a few blocks away. The moment the apartment door closed behind him, Daniel sat back on the couch and studied me with an expression that made me uncomfortable. "So," he said casually, "how long have you two been living together?" "Almost a year." He nodded slowly. "That explains a lot." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel hesitated, as though deciding how much he should say. Finally, he sighed. "Look, Noah would kill me if he knew I was talking about this." My stomach tightened. "Talking about what?" Daniel looked toward the window, where rain had started falling again. "When we were younger, Noah spent years pretending certain parts of himself did not exist. Our family was not exactly great at difficult conversations." He paused before continuing. "He got very good at convincing himself that feelings were temporary, accidental, or easier to ignore." I stared at him, unable to say anything. Daniel noticed my expression and offered a small smile. "You seem important to him, Ethan. More important than he knows how to handle." Before I could respond, the sound of keys echoed from the hallway. Noah stepped back inside carrying a paper bag and immediately sensed that something had changed. His eyes moved from his brother to me. "What did I miss?" he asked. Daniel stood and grabbed the bag from his hands. "Nothing serious." But as Noah looked at me across the room, I realized that for the first time since we had met, pretending that nothing was happening between us was becoming impossible. After Daniel's visit, the apartment felt different again. Nothing had changed on the surface. Noah still left coffee on the counter before work. I still complained whenever he bought the wrong cereal. We still spent evenings on opposite ends of the couch pretending to focus on separate things. But underneath all of it, there was a tension neither of us knew how to address. Daniel stayed through Sunday morning, and by the time he grabbed his overnight bag and headed for the door, the rain had finally stopped. Before leaving, he hugged Noah and said something quietly that I could not hear. Noah rolled his eyes, but a faint smile appeared anyway. Then Daniel turned to me. "Take care of him," he said. "He makes that sound impossible," I replied. Daniel laughed. "Trust me, he does." Once the door closed behind him, silence settled over the apartment. Noah walked into the kitchen and started washing dishes that were already clean. I leaned against the counter, watching him for a moment before speaking. "Your brother seems nice." Noah nodded without looking up. "He talks too much." "Maybe." I hesitated. "He also worries about you." Noah stopped moving for the briefest moment before continuing. "He worries about everyone." I wanted to tell him what Daniel had said while he was gone. I wanted to ask whether it was true that Noah had spent years hiding pieces of himself from the world. More than anything, I wanted to know whether those hidden pieces somehow involved me. but the word stayed trapped somewhere between thought and reality. The following week became one of the busiest of my career. My company had landed a major client, which meant longer hours and impossible deadlines. By Wednesday, I had barely slept. Around 9 that evening, I finally shut down my computer and realized I was the last person left in the office. My phone showed 3 unread messages from Noah. The first asked whether I had eaten dinner. The second simply said, "You are still at work, right?" The third had arrived 10 minutes earlier. I am outside. Confused, I hurried downstairs and stepped into the cold night air. Noah sat inside his car across the street, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. When he saw me, he lowered the passenger window. "Get in." I climbed inside and stared at him. "What are you doing here?" "You forgot your charger this morning." He pointed to the cable sitting in the cup holder. I laughed in disbelief. "You drove 30 minutes through downtown traffic to bring me a charger?" Noah shrugged, staring straight ahead. "You sounded stressed." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I looked at the charger and shook my head. "You realize normal roommates do not do things like this." Noah smiled faintly. "Maybe we stopped being normal roommates a while ago." The sentence landed between us with enough force that I forgot how to respond. Outside, headlights reflected off the wet pavement as people hurried home after work. Inside the car, everything felt strangely still. Noah adjusted the radio, clearly regretting what he had just said. "Forget it," he muttered. "You really need to stop saying that." He turned toward me. "Stop saying what?" "Forget it." "Never mind. Pretend I did not mean that." I laughed nervously. "You say important things and then act like they never happened." Noah leaned back in his seat and let out a tired breath. "Because sometimes I do not know what I am supposed to do with them." For the first time, I saw something fragile beneath his usual calm expression. It was not fear exactly. It was exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for too long. "Noah," I said quietly, "what exactly are we doing?" He stared out the windshield for several seconds before answering. "I honestly do not know." The truth in his voice made my chest tighten. Neither of us did know. We had spent months orbiting around conversations we were too afraid to finish. We blamed timing, coincidence, and accidents because the alternative felt impossible to face. Noah glanced at the clock on the dashboard. "You should get home. You have another early meeting tomorrow." I nodded, but neither of us moved. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt inevitable. Finally, I opened the car door and stepped onto the sidewalk. Before closing it, I looked back at him. "Thank you for the charger." Noah smiled, though it looked different this time, softer somehow. "That was not really why I came." My heart skipped, but before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Olivia. "Have you told him yet?" I looked from the screen back to Noah sitting in the driver's seat, and for the first time since all of this had started, I began to wonder whether the person hiding the most dangerous secret in our apartment had actually been me all along. For the rest of the week, Olivia's message stayed in my mind like an unfinished sentence. "Have you told him yet?" The problem was that I still did not know exactly what I was supposed to tell Noah. Admitting that I cared about him was easy. That truth had become impossible to ignore months ago. The harder question was what that feeling actually meant and whether I was ready to say it out loud. Meanwhile, Noah seemed to sense that something had changed between us. He became quieter, more careful with his words, as though he were waiting for something he could not quite predict. On Friday evening, after another exhausting day at work, I returned home to find him standing in the kitchen, searching through cabinets. "Please tell me you remembered to buy coffee," I said, dropping my keys onto the counter. Noah did not look up. "I remembered coffee. You forgot that tonight is movie night at Claire's place." I stared at him blankly. "That was tonight. You promised 2 weeks ago." I groaned and opened the refrigerator. "Can I cancel?" Noah finally looked at me, amused. "You have become very dramatic lately. I am tired." He handed me a bottle of water. "Then come anyway. You can sit in the corner and judge everyone's movie choices." An hour later, we were walking through Capitol Hill beneath clear skies for the first time in days. The city felt brighter after so much rain, and the sidewalks buzzed with people enjoying the weekend. For once, Noah seemed relaxed. He kept making sarcastic comments about the restaurants we passed, and I found myself laughing more than I had all week. Somewhere between our apartment and Claire's building, I realized how natural everything still felt between us despite the confusion hanging over our lives. Claire opened the door with her usual energy. "You both actually came." I was taking bets. Noah handed her dessert while I stepped inside. The apartment was crowded with familiar faces from game night, and within minutes, everyone had settled into the living room. The movie started, conversations faded, and for a while I managed to forget everything except the story unfolding on the screen. Halfway through the film, Claire announced that she needed more snacks and recruited several people to help her. Noah disappeared into the kitchen with the others, leaving me alone on the couch. A few moments later, Claire returned carrying bowls of popcorn and sat beside me instead of rejoining the group. "You look confused," she whispered. I laughed softly. Apparently, that has become my personality. Claire glanced toward the kitchen to make sure Noah was occupied. "Can I ask you something?" "That depends on the question." She smiled. "What are you afraid of?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because the truth was embarrassingly simple. I was afraid of being wrong. Afraid that I had misunderstood everything. Afraid that if I admitted what I felt, Noah would pull away and our entire life together would disappear. Claire seemed to understand my silence. "You know," she said quietly, "Noah once spent an entire month trying to convince himself that he did not miss you while you were visiting your family." I turned toward her in surprise. "He told you that?" "Not directly, but I have known him long enough to recognize when he cares about someone." She smiled gently. "He is not as mysterious as he thinks he is." Before I could respond, Noah returned carrying drinks. He immediately noticed the expression on my face. "Why do I feel like Claire is causing problems again?" Claire stood and shrugged innocently. "I have no idea what you were talking about." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People laughed, argued about movies, and made plans for the following weekend. But my thoughts stayed fixed on one realization that had become impossible to ignore. Everyone around us seemed to understand what was happening except the two people living inside it. By midnight, guests began leaving. Noah and I offered to help clean up, and soon the three of us were washing dishes in Claire's kitchen. At one point, Claire disappeared into another room to answer a phone call, leaving Noah and me alone beside the sink. Neither of us spoke at first. Then, without warning, Noah dried his hands and looked directly at me. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. My heart immediately started racing. "Sure." He hesitated longer than usual, as though choosing his words carefully. "If things changed between us," he asked, "would you regret it?" The question hit me so suddenly that I forgot how to breathe. Before I could answer, Claire's voice echoed from the hallway, breaking the moment apart. Noah stepped back immediately, his expression unreadable again. But as we walked home through the sleeping city an hour later, I knew that eventually one of us would have to answer the question he had finally dared to ask. The walk home from Claire's apartment was quieter than usual. The city had settled into that strange stillness that only existed after midnight, when the traffic faded and even Seattle seemed to pause for a few hours. Noah walked beside me with his hands buried in his jacket pockets, and neither of us mentioned the question he had asked in the kitchen. But silence had changed between us. It no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like the final moments before something inevitable. When we reached our apartment building, Noah held the door open and let me step inside first. The elevator ride to the fourth floor lasted less than a minute, yet somehow it felt longer than the entire evening. I kept replaying his words in my head. "If things changed between us, would you regret it?" The truth had been sitting in front of me for months. I had simply been too afraid to acknowledge it. Inside the apartment, Noah dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter and headed toward the refrigerator. "Do you want anything to drink?" he asked casually. I shook my head. "Noah." He stopped moving immediately. "Yeah." For the first time since we had met, I forced myself not to look away. "You asked me something earlier." He leaned against the counter, suddenly serious. "You do not have to answer." I laughed softly. "That seems to be our problem." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock above the stove ticked quietly in the background, marking time that suddenly felt very important. Finally, I took a breath. "I do not think I would regret it." Noah stared at me without saying anything. I could almost see him deciding whether to believe what he had heard. "You mean that?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "I think I have known for a while." He looked down at the floor and smiled to himself, though there was something nervous in his expression that I had never seen before. "You know," he said. "For months I kept telling myself that all of this was temporary." "All of what?" Noah laughed softly. "Waiting for you to get home. Looking for excuses to spend time together. Pretending that every moment that mattered was somehow an accident." Hearing him say the words out loud made everything feel strangely simple. We had spent so much time inventing explanations for feelings that had been obvious from the beginning. I sat down on the couch, and Noah joined me a moment later, leaving the familiar distance between us. "Why did you keep pretending?" I asked. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. "Because I was scared." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Noah had always seemed composed, impossible to read, almost untouchable. Admitting fear did not fit the version of him I had built in my mind. "Scared of what?" He turned toward me. "That if I said something and you did not feel the same way, I would lose the best part of my life here." I looked down at my hands, suddenly understanding how similar we really were. We had both spent months protecting ourselves from rejection while slowly becoming the people each other depended on most. I laughed quietly. "It is kind of ridiculous when you think about it." Noah smiled. "Very ridiculous. Claire knew before we did. Claire knows everything." We sat there for several seconds, smiling at the absurdity of our own situation. Then Noah looked toward the hallway closet, where the boxes from the power outage still sat untouched. "Do you remember the photograph you found?" he asked. My heart skipped. "The one from my birthday?" He nodded. "I wrote that note after the party." I remembered the 4 words immediately. "Do not ruin this." "What did you mean by it?" Noah was quiet for a moment before answering. "I meant exactly what it said." He looked at me with an expression that was open and vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. I knew something important was happening between us, and I was terrified that acknowledging it would make everything fall apart. I smiled despite myself. "So your strategy was denial?" It worked for a surprisingly long time. We both laughed, and for the first time in weeks, the tension that had followed us everywhere finally began to disappear. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows again, but the apartment felt warmer than it had in months. Noah stood and walked toward the kitchen before stopping halfway. "There is something else I should admit." I looked up. "What?" He smiled, the kind of smile that had confused me since the day we met. "The movie night 6 months ago was not an accident." I stared at him. "You planned that." "Claire helped." I shook my head, laughing in disbelief. "You were telling me that all this time, everyone knew except me?" Noah crossed his arms. "To be fair, you were not exactly subtle either." I laughed again, feeling something inside me finally settle into place. After months of misunderstandings, hesitation, and carefully chosen silences, the truth turned out to be much simpler than either of us expected. Sometimes the biggest changes in life do not happen all at once. Sometimes they arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments, waiting for 2 people to stop pretending that everything important happened by accident.